The last thing that we need to talk about is what participation and bureaucracies and other things like that look like in authoritarian regimes. While there tend to be some restrictions on types of participation depending on the regime, depending on the area, depending on the desires of those who are in power, sometimes some forms of participation will be allowed. For example, you can still join a political party in an authoritarian system. Even in a system of one-party rule, you can still become a member of the party. You can attempt to become part of the power structure by standing for office to become an influential member of the party. And remember, being part of a party in an authoritarian system, if it is tied to a particular party or ideology, will tend to yield benefits that is given only to members of the party, even if party membership is compulsory. Second, in some forms of authoritarianism, petitioning can happen, and even if there are limits placed on the right to petition or assemble, you can still do these things. You just might have to face the repercussions of dissenting against the will or desires of the group in power. So if I wanted to, I could still call members of the government. I could make them aware of problems or challenges or issues that they might not be akin to, and in some states I can still express my views on the internet. Now, it's a question of the language I may use or how critical I may be of those who are in power that may determine whether or not my act of petitioning or my act of articulating my political interests or views may lead to me to be labeled as a threat to regime security or, the stability of the government. And if those things are true, then I might be a person who might attempt to be co-opted or coerced into shutting my mouth. Voting can still happen in authoritarian regimes, that it now becomes a question of whether or not the elections that you get to vote in either offer competitive choices or if they are free and or fair elections, but you can still vote. In some authoritarian systems, you can protest, you can boycott, you can rally. Again, you can do these things in some states. They may be actions that are banned, but you can still utilize dissent as a mode of participating in the regime. There just may be negative consequences to that action. You can also join some interest groups, and depending on the system will kind of dictate the level of control that the government or the codified regime have over interest groups. So you may have some elements of civil society still thrive in an authoritarian system. It just might become a question of how influential those groups are towards the government. When we talk about bureaucracies in authoritarian regimes, recruitment tends to be based on a variety of affiliations, and you can see that right in China, if I want to be a civil servant, if I want to work for the bureaucracy, then I probably need to be a higher up member of the party to do so. In some instances, you'll see nepotism used as a method for recruitment based on personal or family connections. When we talk about Nigeria, we'll talk about clan, tribal, or ethnic affiliations that may impact your ability to become a member of a bureaucracy. And this is all different from something like a bureaucratic system in the United States, right? We're in the midst of President-elect Trump's cabinet appointees going through their confirmation hearings today, and those individuals are appointed based on political affiliations, based on the connections they have to President-elect Trump. If, though, I wanted to work for the Department of Education and not be like the Secretary of Education, it's just like getting hired for another job, right? And regardless of whether or not I'm a liberal Democrat or a conservative Republican, I should be able to keep that job through administration changes, through changes in the individuals who compose the ruling portions of the government. And that's something that's radically different from recruitment to the bureaucracy in an authoritarian system, because it tends to be based on who you know. Second, bureaucracies in authoritarian regimes tend to be large because of things like their surveillance role to monitor the population, to control the population, to carry out the offered benefits for buying into regime control. Bureaucracies also tend to be less transparent when comparing them to bureaucracies in democratic systems, because there are instances where the ruling government might need to mask what they do. In the United States, if something is not labeled as classified information, you can go to any of the governmental departments' websites and look at all of their governing documents, and if there are things that are missing or things that are classified that you think maybe should not be, then you have the ability to file a Freedom of Information Act request to look at that information, which are things that you cannot do in most authoritarian systems. And then, like I said a few minutes ago, the reason why there also might be large size in addition to the surveillance mechanism of the regime is to distribute the material benefits granted for being loyal to that body. There are a couple of reasons why large bureaucracies may allow authoritarian regimes to implement policy more effectively. The first is that there's greater cohesion in policy implementation. If everybody there is forced to be on the same team, and the expectation is that, or the truth is that there's no opposition, that there's not going to be anybody who blocks the implementation of policy decisions, that the more tight-knit your bureaucracy is in terms of its ideological beliefs, the stronger the mass line is in supporting the implementation of those policies. Second, decision makers become insulated from pressure that they might receive from interest groups, because now, instead of one or two people having the finger pointed at them for political decisions that are being made, it's the entirety of the ruling class, which might give them a target of it's the government as a whole, but individual people aren't going to feel like they're going to be targeted or face electoral repercussions if they vote a particular way. Third, it allows policy to be stronger from iteration of government to government. And that's one of the areas where democracies can be a little bit more unstable than authoritarian systems, right? We are on the verge of President-elect Trump's inauguration, and we know one of the things he has promised to do is roll back a handful of policies passed by President Obama during his administration, which changes or hinders the continuity of policy from the Obama administration to the Trump administration. The exact same thing happened with President Obama overturning some elements of policies from the George W. Bush administration. Bush did the same thing with the Clinton administration. Clinton did the same thing with the George H.W. Bush administration. So authoritarian systems may be a little bit better at having continuous policy because you're not seeing turnover between parties or between ideological groups on as frequent of a basis as you do in a democratic system like the United States, where you have congressional elections every 2 years and presidential elections every 4 years that can wildly change the landscape of the political decision-making. Last, it leads to more building of support between the members of the government and then the members of the bureaucratic bodies, that if everybody is on the same team, then there will be more support for policy when it's implemented through these bureaucratic organizations. The last thing I want to do is touch a little bit more on illiberal regimes. And remember from the early slides from the first part of these lecture videos is that illiberal regimes are faux democracies, that they appear to operate as democracies do, but procedurally they are non-democratic. And the primary reason why most illiberal regimes become labeled illiberal is because there's not a respect for democratic rights. For example, elections are held without much respect to any kind of civil liberty or civil rights. Voters are disenfranchised, voters are intimidated to leave their polling places. If you have voting districts, you will see gerrymandering used to disproportionately impact individuals of racial, ethnic, religious minority groups that prevent them from having a fair voice. Second might be access to the media, where independent media may be either banned from existing or have severe limitations on the types of things that they can publish. It's not uncommon for a lot of illiberal democratic regimes to have state-run or state-owned media entities that serve as nothing more than propaganda machines for the government in power. Third, again, to kind of hinder civil rights or civil liberties, state institutions like the judiciary or the military or state-owned enterprises are controlled by the government, and the government will use that to kind of hose their opposition. And we'll talk about, when we get to studying Mexico, how the Mexican party that was functionally a one-party system in Mexico from post-revolutionary Mexico to about the mid-90s, they would use their power, they would use the ability of state-owned enterprises, they would use the courts, they would use bureaucratic tools, financial tools, to kind of choke off states in Mexico who did not support the party in power. Finally, in illiberal regimes, there tends to be a small or weak level of civil society that you either cannot join interest groups, or these types of groups are operated, run, managed by the state. So naturally, this leads to the question of whether or not non-democratic regimes are in decline. And there have been several individuals who have written a lot about the growth and contraction of global levels of democracy versus authoritarianism versus non-democracies. And we will play with some of those works to determine whether or not democracy is on the increase or the decrease by looking at works by Samuel P. Huntington. We will look at the rise of authoritarianism as a popular brand throughout the world, and I believe Gott is the author on that work. And we'll see if whether or not, this notion of the number of partially free and not free countries on the decline is relatively true or false. This is the end of the section. It's now up to you to look at the slides that follow this that offer a little bit more clarity or a little bit more depth on a few of the regime types that I kind of flew through in the interest of time. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email, ask a question on Classroom, and any of that. This is also the final bit of lecture that will show up on your first Unit 1 quiz, which will be happening in the next couple of days.